Republicans have been registering voters in big, huge numbers. They have been gaining in party registration versus the Democrats in the swing states with party registration. We're talking Arizona. I think it's a 5-point. They've expanded their lead from 5 points from where it was back in 2020. How about Nevada? Big Republican registrations there. They like the early vote. How about North Carolina? Big Republican registration gains. How about Pennsylvania? We spoke about it before a few months ago. Big Republican Party registration gains versus from where they were 4 years ago. So Republicans are putting more Republicans in the electorate. The Democratic number versus the Republican number has shrunk.
If Donald Trump wins, Democrats should have no reason to feel surprised because the signs were there all along. That is essentially the premise of a segment that CNN recently ran when they were talking about approval ratings, voter registrations, and some other key things that look very good for the Trump campaign at the current moment. We'll play it. We'll react to it. I'll give you some of my thoughts on what the CNN guy has to say here. So folks, do us a big favor. If you enjoy the content, be sure to hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. We are a couple days away from the election. It's never been a better time to lock in, hit that subscribe button, support independent media. And with that said, let's just take a listen, okay, at some of the factors that are looking good for Trump. Then I'll tell you what I think.
Just 28% of Americans, voters, think the country is going in the right direction, is on the right track. And I want you to put that into a historical perspective for you. Okay, what's the average percentage of the public that thinks that the country is on the right track when the incumbent party loses? It's 25%. That 25% looks an awful bit like that 28% up there. It doesn't look anything like this 42% doesn't look anything like this 28%. So the bottom line is, very few Americans think the country is on the right track at this particular point. It tracks much more with when the incumbent party loses than with it wins. In fact, I went back through history. There isn't a single time in which 28% of the American public thinks the country is going on the right track in which the incumbent party actually won. They always lose when just 28% of the country believes that the country is on the right track.
It is you are swimming upstream if you're trying to win in this environment.
Right. So this is basically what I would consider to be the common sense. I like to call it the common sense indicator, which is if Americans don't believe the country's headed very well. And by the way, they do largely blame, at the very least, Joe Biden for, say, the economy, for the border, for the current state of the world, a general discontent with the way the country is being run. And if you want to zoom in on certain swing states like North Carolina, where there is no indication that the hurricane may have caused any voter suppression. In fact, we are hearing reports of people in Republican areas surging to the polls, very long lines out of that outrage. This should be common sense. When so many Americans are unhappy with the direction the country is headed, that's just not good news for the incumbent party historically. I think people understand that, but there's some other interesting numbers that CNN discusses here, so let's keep playing this.
Also, President Biden, on a micro level, a lot of the coverage today is over something President Biden said. On the macro level, what kind of a weight is he on the Harris campaign?
Yeah, so, Joe Biden isn't on the ballot, but he's certainly in the minds of Americans, right? So I went back and I looked, okay, was the successor of the same party when the president's net approval rating was negative at this point, which Joe Biden's most definitely is? He's 15 points underwater. Now, we don't know if Kamala Harris is going to succeed Joe Biden, but we know back in 2008, George W. Bush, his approval rating was down in the 20s. Did a Republican succeed George W. Bush? No. How about in 1968, Lyndon Baines Johnson? His net approval rating was negative. Did a Democrat succeed Lyndon Baines Johnson? No. How about in 52, Harry S. Truman? His approval rating was in the 20s, if not the upper teens. Did a Democrat succeed Harry S. Truman in 52? My memory, no. No, as Kate Baldwin says.
Diano.
Diano.
Well
close. Wrong time of the year.
Well played.
Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, succeeded Harry S. Truman. So the bottom line is, for Kamala Harris to win, she'd have to break history, be a Democrat to succeed Joe Biden when Biden's approval rating is way underwater at this point.
Right, so that's something to keep in mind. If our politics are still guided by the historical rules of the way this all works, which I think to some degree they probably are. I mean, you could also argue that the country's so much more polarized now. Things have changed. Trump is an exceptional figure. I think like every aspect of him in politics has largely been unprecedented, but it's still an indicator like this should be good news for us, and it should be common sense. But let's see what the situation now is looking like perhaps on the ground. Like, is that translating to reality? Well, now let's talk about voter registration.
Again, it could happen. It just doesn't in recent history for sure. Okay, registration numbers, Harry.
Yeah, Republicans have been registering voters in big, huge numbers. They have been gaining in party registration versus the Democrats in the swing states with party registration. We're talking Arizona. I think it's a 5-point. They've expanded their lead from 5 points from where it was back in 2020. How about Nevada? Big Republican registrations there. They like the early vote. How about North Carolina? Big Republican registration gains. How about Pennsylvania? We spoke about it before a few months ago. Big Republican Party registration gains versus from where they were 4 years ago. So Republicans are putting more Republicans in the electorate. The Democratic number versus the Republican number has shrunk. And so the bottom line is, if Republicans win, come next week, Donald Trump comes next week, the signs all along will have been obvious. We would look at the right direction being very low, Joe Biden's approval rating being very low, and Republicans really registering numbers. You can't say you...
And see, that right there to me is the most important thing we can use to predict what's going to happen here. Because historical models are interesting and, general wisdom says they should still hold true, but who knows, right? We could have that anomaly. We know all about polls. I mean, polls can be wildly wrong. They historically have underestimated Trump, but you could make a case, okay, maybe this time things are different. But new party registrations, Republicans have been dominating. And here's the thing. The Democrat cope might be, but they're Republicans for Harris. You may have very old school Bush era Republicans who are still registered that, but when they go to the polls in the general election, they're going to vote for the Democrats. Couple problems I see with that theory. Firstly, and most importantly, we're talking about new voter registrations. And so it is true, yes, if you've been a registered Republican since 2004, and maybe you go check the box for Kamala, that's one thing. But if you in the past year are registering as a Republican, you're not doing so to vote for Kamala Harris. That should be pretty common sense, number one. But also number two, I'm not sure, honestly, how many of those people still exist in the electorate. Like, yes, I can definitely imagine that there are a couple old people out there that are, gonna vote for the Democrats, but they were Republicans back 10 years ago and that's still on the voter registration. But considering that Trump has now been in our politics for 9 years, most people know how they feel about him, right? Either you love him or you hate him. I think in 2024, the party registration thing of people flipping to the other side is probably going to be much less, simply because, again, our politics has been so polarized for so many years now. You would think when people go to update their party registration, they're either going to register as a Democrat or at the very least unaffiliated/independent. No, these Republican voter registrations, I think overwhelmingly will be going to Donald Trump and not Kamala Harris. Now, with that said, this is not the only instance of CNN talking about perhaps the good news for Trump. Listen as Frank Luntz recently went on the network to discuss why he thinks the early voting data is looking really bad for the Democrat Party.
We want to discuss the implications of this polling and more with pollster and communications strategist Frank Luntz. Frank, thank you so much for being with us and for bearing through that silliness with Harry Enten. Why do you think Harris is up in Michigan and Wisconsin, but still in this deadlocked race in Pennsylvania? I wonder what you're hearing from focus groups that might explain that.
Well, I'm not convinced that she's up in those states or where things are in Pennsylvania, because in the end, there are voter blocks that are still shifting. The one that I focus on most for Pennsylvania is organized labor, union members, because they do vote, they do participate. They're particularly eager to vote this time. And if you're a government worker or a teachers union member, you are voting for Harris overwhelmingly. But the people who work with their hands, the Teamsters and the trades, Donald Trump is drawing an unusual percentage among these people. And it not only makes him viable, in some of these states, it could be the difference. The other group I'm watching are Latinos. But we've seen a wide variety of polling there. In some cases, Harris is up by 10 points. In other polls, I've seen it up by 22. That group matters in Arizona, matters in Nevada, as well as in the industrial states. So you have to look at this by group.
By the way, on that front, there's so much talk about the Puerto Rican vote and is it going to swing? But it's important to point out, even since 2020, Latinos as a whole have been moving steadily in favor of Trump. And a poll just came out of Puerto Ricans in Florida, which I know are not the Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania necessarily, but you saw similar margins there in 2020 where the Puerto Ricans split about 2-1 for the Democrats. Apparently, Trump is now basically tied. I think the poll actually showed him leading the Puerto Rican vote by 2 points in Florida, which suggests that even if some of the Democrat outrage over that Madison Square Garden rally does translate to a couple point swing among that vote, they still will be way underwater with Hispanics in comparison to where they were in 2016 and even 2020. And yes, Arizona, Nevada, that's going to make the big difference. Even in Pennsylvania, where they're hoping the Puerto Ricans will deliver it for Harris. Well, I don't know. The data so far actually is not necessarily showing that.
For Harris, nothing matters more than 18 to 29-year-old women. If she can make them a higher percentage of the total vote than they normally make up, that's her road to victory. For Donald Trump, it's key to him to ensure that his own vote turns out in record numbers, because 2020 is not enough for him. He's got to do something that he hasn't done since 2016, which is that everyone who says they support him actually go out and vote. And one last thing.
True.
The early vote right now suggests that the Republicans are doing better now than they have in either of the last two elections. I'm not convinced of whether that is cannibalizing the eventual vote on Election Day, but I tell you that it's got Democrats worried as hell because something clearly is happening out there.
Yeah, they're seeing it in North Carolina. I was just talking to someone there, and there is some worry for sure.
There should be. So there you have it, guys. Basically, the point of today's video, a lot of things are looking good for us. Historical indicators, polls, honestly, lately at the current moment are looking good for us. The early vote data. But let's also be clear, and Frank Luntz did kind of throw in a point there that Kamala Harris absolutely does still have a path to victory. I think it's very plausible. I wouldn't be shocked, honestly, if what happens is, especially 18 to 29-year-old young women, but women in general, are brainwashed by the abortion and Project 2025 talking point, and enough of them turn out. I mean, after all, they are typically higher propensity voters than men, and that happens. Right. And you see an electorate like that. Kamala Harris absolutely has a path to victory just on the backs of the female vote alone. And that's precisely why everyone who supports Trump needs to show up and vote. Right. It's going to come all down to turnout. And we should not get complacent at the same time, because you're going to say, what is Kamala Harris running her campaign on? Abortion? Like, can you really win a national campaign based on abortion? The answer, honestly, is yes. That's exactly what you saw in some races in 2022, but that was also only enabled because a lot of potential Republican voters got complacent. They stayed home. They didn't vote. We cannot allow that to happen this time. So make sure you vote. Make sure all your friends are voting for Trump. And let's do this, because it's looking good so far. We're going to talk about some of the early vote data in some of these states in an upcoming video, but we got to finish the job, right? And we got to make sure, yes, we do not cannibalize ourselves or whatever else. So that said, ladies and gentlemen, let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe if you are new, and until next time, God bless and peace.